I go through this PowerPoint, and sort of what I've heard from the lectures is that people are worried about copying down slide for slide what's on the PowerPoint, and I wouldn't worry too much about that. And ideally you would just sort of listen and get most of your notes through what I say. What's on the PowerPoint is mostly just like bulletin points for me as I talk and examples for you. So in terms of notes, it's just easier to not just stick to the PowerPoint, but what I say. So here's if you downloaded that from the website, here's the PowerPoint, and I'll just go ahead and begin. So the focus of this lecture, this PowerPoint, is affirmative strategy. That means the sort of way you need to approach being affirmative when you are debating. You're affirmative half the times. So this lecture will include things like how to write the 1AC, how to prepare your 2AC, and as well as how to consider maybe what the negative strategy against your affirmative will be and how to prepare in advance for that. So the first part of this lecture, so before I get into the meat of the lecture, there's two things that I want you to eventually take from this lecture and that you should know about being affirmative. First is that the main advantage of being affirmative is that you most likely will read the same affirmative the entire year, or at least at this camp, you'll read the same affirmative at this camp. And for most of the year, you'll read the same affirmative. And even if you read new affirmatives, the advantage that you have is that you get to prepare in advance and know before the negative team knows what affirmative you're reading. And thus, you sort of have the upper hand. Like in any game, in going chess, it's advantageous to go first. And if you can predict what the negative team's next move is, then any sort of preparation that you have towards that is extremely important. And practice is extremely important when you're affirmative. You can practice writing answers to common negative arguments. You can give practice 2AC speeches, right? So if you're doing practice debates or getting ready for the camp tournament, at this tournament, you already know what the negative arguments that the negative can say are going to be, right? And now this might not be always as predictable as it is at other tournaments, but for the camp tournament, there's like 5 negative arguments that a team can say. And so you should perfect and practice your 2AC blocks to those arguments, and it will be really hard for any negative team to win. And the second thing that you should know is that being affirmative is a 3-move game. Who thinks they know what I mean when I say being affirmative is a 3-move game? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Be one step ahead of the other team.
Okay, be one step ahead of the other team. What do you think that means?
So you have your first move, then you predict their second move, and how you're going to answer that.
So what most teams, when they're writing an affirmative, they just think about what's interesting to them and what advantages they would like to talk about. And that's also helpful when being affirmative, but you have to think and predict what is the negative argumentation against your affirmative going to be. And then in the 1AC, you need to modify what your first move is going to be based off what you think the negative second move is going to be, right? So if you know, for example, that a team always reads the China counterplan, what type of advantage might be useful to include into the 1AC? Yeah, either the China advantage that's in the packet or any advantage that only the U.S. has the capability of resolving. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in some examples. So part 1 of this lecture is writing the affirmative, specifically figuring out what the negative is going to say and argue against your affirmative, and choosing the affirmative based off that and a few other things. So the first thing that you should consider when choosing and writing an affirmative is what common negative arguments is the negative going to make on this year's topic? So the first place that you look for this is the resolution. And the resolution says increase economic engagement towards Cuba, Mexico, and Venezuela. So what sort of predictable negative ground might there be on this topic? Well, there's economic engagement generally being bad. So your affirmative needs to have a defense of economic engagement, or it needs to have a specific defense of your particular type of economic engagement. And now just looking at what was in the negative packet for this camp, you can sort of get an idea of where the negative arguments might go towards. So there's the China counter plan, the China disad, the politics disad, and so given that those are some predictable negative grounds, there's also like the spending disad, which was talked about in the disads lecture, or non-engagement, or like the containment counterplan, which was talked about at the counterplan lecture. And given that those are predictable negative arguments, you want to consider that when you're writing your 1AC. So for example, if, like we said, if there's the China counterplan, you might want to have evidence or an advantage that says why China doing the plan is bad and why U.S. doing the plan is preferable. Or if some team likes to read the containment for a counterplan versus engagement apps, then you might want to have a defense of engagement over containment built in your advantages. So choosing the affirmative that you write. So given that you should consider many of the negative arguments and negative strategies that people might read against your affirmative, there are many strategic decisions that you have to consider. You have to consider, so the 4 parts of the advantages that we've talked about uniqueness, link, internal link, impact, same as disadvantage. You have solvency. You want to have links or internal links that make it difficult for the negative to access. You need to make the strategic decisions that assume what the negative is going to say, and then alter and make strategic decisions based off that information. So, like again, that's just like reading a U.S. key advantage, etc. Other strategic decisions that you need to consider are what type of affirmative you're going to read. And so there's a couple different types. There's one that is sort of in the heart of the literature. So if someone does a simple search for how can we economically engage Cuba, what do you think is probably the main thing that comes up? Removing the embargo. Yeah, exactly. So if someone wanted to read a mainstream Cuba app, which has a ton of literature about it, then it would be easy to research why removing the embargo we have towards Cuba is a good idea. There's a lot of advantages to that. What's the advantages to reading a mainstream affirmative? Yeah.
You have like credible sources.
Okay, credible sources. A lot of literature. Yeah. So there's always going to be a lot of evidence, a lot of people talking about your affirmative, so it will be easy to defend in research. But what is sort of the problem with a mainstream affirmative? There's a lot of literature talking about it. There's a lot of people defending that sort of the in Cuba embargo, right? So these are all things that you have to consider. And so if you're a if you can research a ton and can do better research than the teams that you're most likely debating against, it might help you to have a mainstream app, because you can just cut more cards, do more research, and find more evidence than the negative team. So there's a plethora of evidence that you can find, and if you can find more of it than the other team, you're most likely going to be in a good position. Now, the other type of affirmative is just the opposite of a mainstream affirmative. And sort of, I would probably would consider the affirmative that was written at this camp a little less mainstream and a little more squirrely, because it's a very small portion of the embargo, and it's a very small example of a way we can economically engage Cuba. So what do you think the advantage of having a squirrely aff might be? A one that is not necessarily in the literature, but one that has some arguments supporting it, but might be a little harder to research. Yeah.
There's not a lot of evidence against it either.
Okay, so the fact that there's not a lot of evidence for doing the affirmative or really talking about it, there's also not going to be a lot of negative arguments against it. Okay. Another important thing to consider is, Hayes probably talked about this at his negative strategy lecture, but the way that you write negative strategies is you can't always write specific case negs for every small little affirmative that any team has written. And so the way that you prepare when you're negative is that you write generic strategies that cover broad areas of the topic, right? And so having a squirrely app means that it's very likely that your small affirmative or your small little area of the topic is not going to be covered by what the negative has prepared for. So if you have a small affirmative, then it's very likely that the negative as a whole is not prepared to debate against it, right? And so if someone was preparing for this topic and wrote the China counterplan, then the swirly Cuba drilling app has a lot of strategic utility, because the sort of umbrella that the negative has tried to create with the China counterplan doesn't necessarily cover a drilling app, which has a lot of U.S. keywords and a China-specific advantage. Okay? Now, what might be a problem with a little squirrely, less predictable affirmative?
Like, there won't be much literature.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Kieran.
Well, if it's unpredictable with the bank, then say, like, pull a T penalty.
Yeah, definitely. So, two things there is that the further you try to move away from the topic, or try to move away from the umbrella that the negative has sort of tried to create, the more likely that you're moving into untopical areas of the topic. That's good. And then second is that there's less literature defending the affirmative. And the problem with this is that some of your advantages and internal links in link arguments might be a little bit more contrived. And like with the Cuba embargo app, there will be an advantage that, is very good that says removing the Cuba embargo is the only way to establish U.S.-Cuban relations. But reading a U.S.-Cuban relations advantage and you do something very small and squirrely, it's unlikely that you'll be able to solve, right? And the evidence that you read is a little bit more contrived. And the next point is sort of what Tiernan talked about is there's sort of a trade-off with talking about the core areas of the topic and topicality. So you have to make a strategic decision based off your own skills. What's better for the way that you debate. If you like debating topicality, then it might help you to move towards a smaller area of the topic. But if you like talking about core areas and core advantages, like U.S. influence in Latin America, then it might be helpful to have, advantages that are like a very mainstream affirmative that would actually be able to solve that. In terms of choosing advantages, you want to have a couple of different advantages. You want to have, your mainstream core advantages that are easy to defend and are about core areas of the topic. And you also want to have advantages that are a little smaller and a little less predictable by the negative. And that will make it harder for them to prepare for. And again, you want to sometimes choose advantages based on what you like. and I'm sure many of you have looked at the Cuba app. I know our lab has, and sort of realize what advantages you like and make the most sense to you, and what advantages you might not want to read in your 1AC. And so just even with the 3 advantages that we have in the packet, you can pick and choose which ones you like a little bit better. So any questions about that? Just considering negative strategy when picking your affirmative. That's a huge part of being affirmative. Okay, so the second part of this lecture is about,
Austin.
yeah.
Real quick, before you move on, when you're choosing an advantage, like let's say you're going for not necessarily a sketchy. Let's say you're like trying to do topic studies on Venezuela, right? So when you're trying to get like case specific, like, or when you're trying to look for neg articles, I guess would you be researching what they could read against you on case once you figured out like a plan text, or just like a general overall the economic standpoint of the neg?
Well, one thing that's helpful now is that most camps are open source, so you can sort of, after all of the camps are over, you can take sort of a scan of, and actually you should probably just write down a list of every single negative argument that has been researched and produced at every single debate camp. And then that will give you a really good idea about where the negatives are going to go. And most likely they won't go in a totally different direction that the camps are running. But yeah, a lot of that comes with just sort of understanding the research area and the topic area through starting with broad research.
Right.
And then, yeah. But like every decision, so let's say you start out broad and then you move towards like a squirrely topic area. You then want to research that affirmative ground, or that affirmative, and figure out what negative arguments, given that you picked a really small affirmative, what negative arguments the neg team might eventually say.
So you want to go, but when I'm researching, would you say, let's say I have my entire affirmative written, which is, in a hypothetical world, I have my entire affirmative written. Would you say when I'm doing neg research that I would be researching specifics first, or I go broad with what they could say and then specifically for the app?
Oh, so you're saying how should you prepare?
How should I handle the preparations for what they could say? Specific first?
Well, it depends on what the affirmative is. If it's very small and sort of away from the topic, and maybe no one even read it at a camp, then you do want to start out broad, because it's at the beginning of the year, it's unlikely that teams will have very specific strategies against your affirmative. But then you want to move towards the specific stuff, because as the negative strategy develops, you want to be able to develop your answers, right? So having good answers to the generics, but ideally if you've picked a squirrely app, then the generics probably might not apply as well. So your 1AC already has built-in answers to make those arguments unstrategic.
Okay, cool.
But yes, at the beginning, start out broad.
But let's say let's say the affirmative is like basically like the definition of economic engagement, like not necessarily, like let's say it's like engage Venezuela for oil, right? So we do things with them for the oil trade.
Yeah.
So then would you say like maybe start out with specific searches and then go broad? Or would you
Yes, like if you're looking for affirmative cards and negative strategies, you can usually get an idea of what people are generally going to say against economic engagement generally, but I would definitely figure out what they're going to say against oil strategies.
Okay. All right.
Okay. So one of the crucial questions about creating the 1AC is how many advantages are we going to read? Now, how many people have been like, you know what, I'm going to read like 6 advantages, and there's no way the other team's going to be able to answer them all? Yeah. Okay, so only one person?
I have
Hi, Deontay too. Come on. That's the people I'm sure have. And so the choice that you have to make is, do you read like one or two sort of big developed advantages, or do you read a lot of not really well developed advantages? So sort of you can see the pros and cons up there, but what's the intuitive benefit of reading many, many advantages?
They're not able to answer everything.
They might not be able to answer all of the advantages, right, exactly.
Is that a good thing? And a good thing?
Well, yeah, that's a good thing, right? If the negative isn't able to answer your advantages, that, is very helpful because they've not answered a main part of your offensive argument, okay? But the problem is that if they're not well developed, the burden that the negative has to answer those is a lot lower, right? Because with a well-developed advantage, the negative has to have well-developed answers. But if the advantage itself is not well-developed, then the negative doesn't really have to have well-developed responses to that advantage. Does that make sense? So there's a lot of pros and cons that you need to consider when picking how many advantages. For the most part, I would recommend at this camp to not do the, read as many advantages possible, as many impacts as possible. I would focus on developing 2 advantages and having built-in answers and becoming really well knowledgeable about the 2 advantages that you have chosen to read, and adding sort of what Michaela talked about in her lecture, and we'll talk about a little bit later, having arguments that might be able to preempt common case arguments, right? So in our lab, we did a bunch of debates about the Cuban economy advantage. What was like the first argument in the neg to answer the Cuban economy advantage, Deontay?
That we're not trying to, the Venezuelan oil?
Yeah.
That we're not trying to cut off the Venezuelan oil.
That Venezuela won't cut off our oil, right? So if you're reading the Cuban economy advantage, then it might be helpful to have maybe definitely 1, but maybe 2 or 3 cards that really defends that point. And then at that point, it's really hard for the negative to even try to answer that. So you need to, all things you need to consider. And then lastly, the sort of problem with maybe reading 1 or 2 simple advantages is that even though the negative has to spend time developing their answers, most of the time the advantages aren't going to be that diverse and will be a little bit stale and predictable. So the negative will have in-depth responses. So, but ideally, if your affirmative is developed, then that shouldn't really be a problem. Okay? Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. The second important step after you've chosen an affirmative is writing the specific plan text. And just like anything, you want to determine how many advantages you read and how you write your plan. And pretty much every decision you make about being affirmative, it needs to be centered around what the negative is going to say. Okay? You should write your plan and then consider how will the negative team attack or approach the way that I've written this plan, right? So an important thing is, to consider is every word that's in the plan text, you should consider, does that word need to be in the plan text, right? Why is the plan text a very important part about being affirmative?
When people come up with the resolution, do they think this thoroughly, or do they just come up with it and say, okay, let's see what they can come up with?
Both yes and no. So when they write a topic paper and propose it, and then it gets voted on. And most topic papers have sort of a here's the broad resolution that we have. Here's a big list of possible affirmative areas, and here's a big list of negative areas. And then coaches around the country sort of vote on a couple things. Mainly, is the ground between the affirmative and negative equitable? And is the ground interesting? Basically, they sort of consider those two things. So the answer is yes, they have a big list of things that could possibly be included under the topic, but that list is nowhere near complete or really thought about as in depth as it would for a whole year of rigorous testing. Yep. Okay, so back to my original question. The plain text is one of the most important parts about the affirmative, because when it really just tells you clearly what the affirmative does, and if you're a negative team preparing, a lot of your negative preparation should be centered around the other team's plan text, right? And so if you can sort of, the way you write the plan, dictate the negative strategy or account for the negative strategy, then you're already one step ahead in the three-move game that I talked about at the beginning. And so, like I said, every word that you include needs to be considered. Is that word important, right? And so, why is word choice an important consideration? Yeah, yeah.
Because if you mess up and use the wrong word, it could like jeopardize you not winning.
Why?
Because like if you mess up a word and you can basically change the meaning or the miniature, you can probably basically change the meaning or what the sentence or the word that you're trying to say, and it can make it seem that's something that you didn't want to say.
Your plan text could be doing something that maybe your solvency evidence isn't really talking about.
Right.
If you use the wrong word, so it could hurt you in terms of solvency. Yeah.
For like the word picks, I know like last year there was like the climate resilient apps. There's a word pick out of like climate adaptation.
Yeah.
And
So word picks, and we haven't really talked about this too much in any of the lectures that I've seen. Maybe he's mentioned it in his next strategy. A word pick is sort of, it uses a different word that's in the plan text and says that the use of that specific word is bad and is a bad form of rhetoric. And, we might talk about this a little bit more when Rob talks about critiques on Friday, but, you want to consider, is using a particular type of word dangerous, or, is there an offensive argument that the negative can say against it? If so, then there's really no reason why you should ever include that, right? So, on last year's topic, if I was an affirmative team and had climate change or climate adaptation in my plan text, the second that I found out someone read a climate adaptation word pick, that word would never be in my plan text ever again, okay? Because there's almost no reason to ever include it. And other things, we talked about plan inclusive counterplans in the counterplan lecture, where they pick out of a small random part of your affirmative, like a random part of Cuban drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, right? We talked about that example in the counterplans lecture. And so why would you ever, if you were writing this plan text for the Cuba drilling affirmative, why would you ever specify where the drilling occurs? You shouldn't never really do that unless you have a defense of including that in your plan text. Does that make sense to most people? Okay. And just the same thing, because word choice matters, because the plan text is sort of the focus of where the negative will go. Second thing to include is you should not include unnecessary resolution words that are in the resolution, in your affirmative unless you have a defense of them, right? So who can tell me what the plan text as written is for the Cuba affirmative?
Oh, no, just kidding.
It's authorized something, right?
It's authorized private companies to.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's the United States federal government should authorize like joint contracts between Cuba and the United States. Why do you think we chose that plan text over one like this? The USFG should substantially increase economic engagement to Cuba by authorizing joint oil contracts between the United States and Cuba. Anyone? Why do you think we chose that plan text over that plan text? Yeah.
It's kind of redundant.
It's a little bit redundant, yeah. And there's no reason to include the phrase economic engagement in your plan text when ideally the authorization of joint oil contracts is already economic engagement. You don't have to tell the other team that you're definitely economic engagement. And there's other strategies that people can read if you read a plan text like this. But they're a little bit complicated, so I'll just briefly mention it. For anyone know what the offsets counterplan is? Yeah, you know.
Yeah, maybe like put it off.
It's a counterplan that wouldn't necessarily increase economic engagement as a whole, but keeps the total level of economic engagement at 0, right? And so that counterplan becomes competitive because the phrase increase economic engagement is in the plan. So you don't have to include that. And then just sort of a general rule when writing the plan, anytime you include a specific word or become more specific with a plan, you need to have a defense of that. Not necessarily in the 1AC, but some piece of evidence that defends that word or that sort of action in case the negative sort of picks out or says that part of your plan is bad. Okay, just general rule, always have a defense of the things that you have in the negative, or that you have in the plan. Sorry. And sort of what I've been trying to harp on in this lecture is that an important part about choosing the affirmative and writing the 1AC is preempt common negative arguments, right? And so, again, a lot of what Michaela said also applies here is that if you have, common negative arguments that you hear every single debate with your affirmative, right? So, for those of you, I don't think anyone's done a practice debate yet, but if you're reading this Cuban affirmative, what argument do you expect to hear every round at this tournament? U.S. not key. So like China counterplan, or just U.S. not key? China counter. Both those are the same sort of arguments. So it will really help to include maybe 2 or 3 or 4 cards in the 1AC that says why the U.S. is important to solve, because instead of reading those 4 cards in the 2AC, you've already read them in the 1AC, right? So then you can just extend them. Another example is you want to have answers to common negative arguments. So one thing that I can think of is that in the 1AC for the Cuban economy advantage, the one that says that Venezuela will cut off oil supply, it talks about the new president Maduro and says that he actually will cut off oil supply. And the reason why that card was included, one that specifically mentions the new president, is because a common negative argument is that that new president won't cut off oil, okay? And so it might be helpful to have 1 or 2 cards already in the 1AC, so you can, when the other team reads a piece of evidence to make that argument, you've already read 2 pieces of evidence to answer that. And so not only does that help you save time, but perceptually to the judge, how do you think that helps you?
Looks like you're prepared.
It looks like you're prepared. So like if the negative tries to be like, oh yeah, did you even know about this new president that's not going to cut off oil supply? And it's like, yeah bro, we did. We got 2 cards in the 1AC. So it looks pretty good to the judge. Shows you're prepared, and also it helps you sort of know your affirmative. And just the same sort of thing, you want to include common answers to counterplans like US key or certainty key. Many of the things that we talked about in the counterplan lectures and how to answer counterplans should also be included in the 1AC. And then the final thing that you should really consider in the 1AC is having maybe 1 or 2 impact calculus cards. So, like I know there's like a bioterrorism card. Like for the Cuban economy advantage, there's that LNG impact. And then what is one of the cards in there? One of the cards in there is an impact calculus card, and it's specifically one line. Do you know what line I'm talking about?
LNG outbreaks into the war.
Yeah, exactly. And because that card says like an LNG explosion would have the same impact as like 55 Hiroshima bombs, right? And that is already comparing the magnitude of an LNG explosion to just like a regular nuclear war, okay? So having built-in impact calculus stuff is always important. Okay. The second part of this lecture third part, is about the 2AC. And sort of what Michaela said, the 2AC is the time where you defend your house. You have already got this good 1AC that you've written, and it's time, and the negatives made their initial attack against it, and now it's time for the 2A to come in and defend the house. So, what are common tips that you should do when preparing the 2AC? The first thing that you should do is to assess the 1NC strategy. To look at the 1NC and figure out what arguments can the negative viably go for, right? So that includes making sure that you know exactly what the counterplan they've read against you is. And that includes looking at the counterplan text to see if they've written it right. Asking what the net benefits are to each counterplan. Because then you can sort of predict maybe if the counterplan relies a lot on the net benefits, then they might have to go for that counterplan. Also, is there a viable topicality option? A lot of times people will read topicality as sort of a throwaway argument, like A-spec, O-spec, whatever. I'm sure Hayden talked a little bit about arguments that are not as viable as topicality violations, but there are probably some that are, not as viable. So if you're reading an app that is conditional economic engagement, if a team reads that economic engagement has to be unconditional, then that's something that is probably viable, right? And you have to answer that. But if they've read like economic engagement is conditional, then that's not viable at all, right? Because it totally actually proves that your app's topical. And there are other examples that as you become more familiar with the topicality violations, you can sort of figure out which ones are viable and which ones are not. And then, just like some disads are net benefits to counterplans, some disads aren't. And in order for the negative to go for them, they have to defend the status quo, okay? What does defend the status quo mean? Defend what's happening now, right? And the advantage to making the negative defend the status quo is what? What's the advantage of the negative? What's the advantage for the affirmative in forcing the negative to defend the status quo?
Means that there's
Nothing needs to be fixed. That's what-
Right, but you've spent 8 minutes. Yeah, Deontay? Are you stretching? You've spent 8 minutes of the 1AC isolating problems of the status quo, right? And so, in order for the neg to have to defend the status quo, what do they have to do of the 1AC? They have to answer all of the parts in the 1AC, right? So if there's a disad that makes them defend the status quo, but they've only answered half the 1AC, is the neg in a good position? No, exactly, right? And so if the 1NC is one that doesn't answer all of the case, then it's likely that they might have to go for a counterclaim. And then, based off that, you have to not only consider the 1 in C shell, but, also consider maybe how that 1 in C will develop, and how, going into the negative block, where will that argument go? So, in terms of negative strategy, what I'm sure Hayes said was that, you have a 1 in C shell, and the thing with the 1 in C shell is that it's just the shell. It's the outer layer, and it's not the very in-depth details of the negative argument, right? So you have to consider how good or viable an argument is, not just based off the 1 in C shell, but how that argument will develop. And that is a little hard at first, but comes mostly with experience. And sort of what I said is you have to isolate and limit the negative strategy. So here's an example. The negative reads 3 off-case positions, one of which is the China counterplan, the politics disad, and the China disad, and then they've only made 2 arguments on each advantage. So what does the negative, in this case, almost have to go for? Well, yeah, one of the off-case. The counterplan. Why the counterplan? Right, because they don't have they don't have good answers to your advantage. So the only way that they could sort of deal with your advantages is not by defending the status quo, because they think they haven't really dealt with all of the problems with the status quo. But the only way that they could feasibly overcome that problem is by having a counterplan that solves your case. And that way, in your 2AC, you can spend more time on the options that are viable. Like in this instance, the China counterplan, but maybe in some instances, Capital. The second tip for any good 2AC is to have add-ons. Who knows what add-ons are? Henry?
It's like an additional advantage that you read in like a
Yeah, it's like a very small advantage that you can add on to your affirmative in the 2AC. And so there's a couple of them in the Cuba affirmative, but the one that makes the most sense is the Obama credibility one, which is that if Obama sends a signal to Latin America, it will help his credibility. What argument is this Obama credibility add-on useful against?
Politics.
Politics? What?
Because what politics is that kind of increases Obama's credibility or his political capital. So if you read a menu that or an add-on that says that increases his
Well, the add-on that's in this file is not about his credibility with Congress, rather his credibility on foreign policy.
I think, Mr. President, they just don't like him because they lack their respect of him. The way he runs things, they don't like his plans that he's coming forward. So that's the real reason why there's conflict between them.
Yeah, but what argument is it useful to read this add-on against?
China counterplan.
China counterplan, right? The China counterplan doesn't have Obama act, and thus they cannot solve Obama's credibility. Does that make sense to everyone? And so you want to pick and choose what add-ons you read based off the negative strategy. After you've assessed the 1 in C strategy, you want to pick and choose. So let's say there was someone read the containment counterplan. What type of add-on would you want to read?
Add-on based on increasing.
Like engagement being yes, so.
This is like specific towards the cube oil. Can you explain the 2 and C argument for the like alt cause claim that they make on the add-on? Because that's the answer, just like asking for that.
What's the card say?
Well, the card basically says like
What's the tag say?
it says all causes Guantanamo Bay, but it's saying like we should just like shut down the base and it helps solve for like Middle Eastern issues.
No, well, that's so. It's not you. I think the way that you've explained it, you're thinking about it as like that card is a counterclaim card.
Well, no, it's
What it's saying is that without closing Guantanamo Bay and overcoming the huge human rights credibility issue that Obama and the U.S. have, it is impossible for the one-shot instance of the plan to overcome the massive credibility deficit that we already have, right? So with the add-on, it's basically
so like Guantanamo
It's
Bay
like-
is key to regaining some foothold in credibility.
yeah, but I wouldn't think about it this way. So what's the uniqueness claim that you're making when you read that add-on? Where is Obama's credibility now?
Multilateralism.
Or just low? Obama's credibility is low. Yeah?
Right. Yeah.
And that you're saying that the plan is able to boost his credibility, right?
Right.
That card is saying that the plan is insufficient to solve Obama's credibility because there are other causes to his credibility deficit, like Guantanamo Bay, human rights issues, Middle Eastern issues as well, right?
Okay.
Okay, so picking add-ons are very helpful for the affirmative because they're also unpredictable, and if the negative is already beating your other advantages, they're most likely not going to cover the add-on as well, and it gives you another advantage, while less developed is something that you can go for in the 2AR. Where can you read an add-on? Pretty much any flow. It makes the most sense to read it on a flow that it directly responds to, but you can pretty much read it wherever. Okay, how to order the 1AC or 2AC. This is pretty much a blueprint for 95% of the debates that you're going to have, and I wouldn't order it any other way for the remainder of this camp. First, you want topicality. Why do you want to put topicality first? It's an apt burden to prove. So think about it this way. The 2AC is a time-pressured speech, right? And if you undercover you want to think about it as, which one of these positions do I not want to undercover? Okay? So if you undercover topicality or don't answer topicality, then you lose. You lose the debate. So you want to put it first, make sure you answer it. Second, you want to put your case arguments at the top. Just like Michaela said in her last lecture, putting case arguments and you're putting your offense at the very top is always important. The only reason why you put topicality over the case is because it's a procedural, it's an apt burden, you have to prove it first. And then you put your case second because that's your offense. And that's the offense you want to talk about. Just like we talked about in our lab, you always want to put your offense first. So, that makes sense to everyone? And then if you undercover or drop case arguments, then you have no offense, right? And it's really hard for you to win the debate, right? If you're a sports team and you have no offense,
You lose.
yep, exactly. So the next is you want to put counter plans and critiques after the case. Why is that? So the counterclaim can solve, right? So even if you answer all of the negatives case arguments, right, and you've won your offense, but there's counterplan that solves both of your advantages or all three of your advantages, and you don't answer it, then it's not looking too good for the affirmative, right? And it's looking really good for the negative. So you want to put that next. And then fourth, you want to put disadvantages. You want to put disadvantages last, right? And you even within disadvantages, you order them in order of importance. So if politics is a net benefit to the China counterplan, then you want to put politics before like an economic engagement bad disad, which might link to the counterplan, right? if you've already assessed the 1 and C strategy and know that it's not viable for them to defend the status quo, then you want to put the dissets that are the least viable at the bottom. Does that make sense to everyone? I would say this, in terms of writing a 2AC, this slide is one of the more important slides. Okay? So, like if there was a trivia question later tonight in our lab about how to order the 2AC, this could be, helpful.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
When you're ordering the 2AC, so let's say, in a hypothetical debate around that, someone would read like 3T violations, and then like they read a good bit of like casework. They read like a security K, like the private's counterplan, and like politics dissent, right? If you're trying to get through it, what it would be when you're going down the list, it would at that point, since like they're overwhelming you with a large amount of stuff that you wouldn't be able to answer, you would just aim for those big, like the big arguments that they'd be making.
I guess I don't fully understand what you're asking. I mean,
Sorry,
the thing is, like, if all of those options are equally viable, then you want to spend an equal amount of time.
Okay.
But if you think that,
One
based
is-
off negative scouting, that the team's going to go for politics and case, then you might want to spend a little more time.
Okay. Sweet.
So everyone good? Away a lot. I can move away from this slide.
Yeah.
All right. Other tips for being affirmative. You want to always write blocks. Okay. Who can tell me what a block is? Pre-written answers, yeah. Pre-written answers to common negative arguments, right? So if you're preparing for the tournament at the end of this camp, what kind of things do you want to write blocks to?
Everything that they're gonna do.
Everything.
You know they're gonna say.
Like you already know what the negative's going to say. So you should write blocks. So that includes already having a written out answer to Venezuela won't cut off oil. Already have an answer to Cuban oils not like able to be commercialized, right? Because you know that you'll hear that in every single debate, right? And think about if any like practice speech or practice debate that you've done, when you've heard an argument that you've already heard, but you had to rewrite out your answer, right? That's kind of a waste of time. If you've already written out your answer somewhere else, why would you ever want to rewrite it again? So write it one time, practice it, make it perfect, and then you never have to write it again for the tournament. And then the second thing that is also important is what's called backflowing. So this is for all of the 1As out there, and also for 2As, because you should force your 1A to do this. Backflowing is when you're giving the 2AC, you're giving your speech. It's always important for, even though you gave the speech, to have a copy of the flow of the speech. Why is that important? If you're the 2A, why do you need to have a flow of the 2AC?
Because, like yesterday, if 1A speaks next, then they need to have a copy as well, so they can go ahead and extend the argument.
Wait, the 1A already has a copy because they're flowing for themselves.
Oh, you can have one, so you can be able to flow.
Right, so you can be able to flow, right? So the next, after the 2AC, the negative block is next. And the 2A needs to have a good flow and know maybe what arguments the negative block dropped or didn't answer well. And it's just always helpful to have a good flow. And if the 2A doesn't have a good flow of what was in the 2AC, then it's really hard to develop later in the debate. Okay. So again, for the 2AC, some just sort of brief overview. Most of this was covered in individual lectures focused on these arguments, but some tips on how to answer topicality. You should always have a counter interpretation. That was talked about in the topicality lecture. For counterplans, always have a permutation and always have a theory argument because that puts pressure on the negative to answer. And then for disadvantage, you always want to have an argument about why their impact to the disad is small. So impact defense. Okay, so another part of 1AR strategy is, Aff Strategy is the 1AR. And so a couple of tips I have for giving a good 1AR is first, you should be in constant communication with your 2A. Both before the tournament, so you have a familiar idea what arguments against common negative strategies you want to go for, and then both during and also during the round, and so you know what arguments you want to go for, right? So what I talked about at the very beginning was that the advantage to being affirmative is that you get to prepare and be familiar with common negative arguments, right? So if you've talked about this with your partner before a tournament, right? If you've talked about the China counterplan with your partner, you should already have an idea of what type of argument you want to go for against the China counterplan. And that minimizes the amount of prep time and communication that you have to do in a debate round, right? So it saves a lot of time. So both communicate with your 2A what argument does the 2A want to go for in the 2AR, both before the tournament, before the round, and in the round. A few other tips about giving the 1AR. You need to be able to put pressure on the 2 and R. This includes theory arguments which have increased value because the 2 and R perceives them as a threat and has to spend more time answering them. And the 2 and R really has no idea whether or not you plan on going for a theory argument, but the fact that it's in the 1AR puts pressure on the 2 and R, and then if the 2AR decides not to go for it, then that can only save you time. Another strategy to put pressure on the 2 and R is that you have to pick and choose what app arguments are the best, but you also have to be diverse in the 1AR. And I'll contrast this with the 2AR a little bit later, but you want to have, so assuming you've already talked with your 2A about what arguments you want to go for, you also, knowing that, you want to be able to develop what arguments you want to go for, but then you also want to have a diverse set of arguments to put pressure on the 2 and R. So what I mean by this is that, let's say you're going against the China counterclaim, right? And you already know that you want to go for the solvency deficit about U.S. expertise on drilling, right? Then you could consider spending time developing that argument, but also extending the permutation, because the negative has to answer the permutation, extending another solvency deficit that is different from expertise, like maybe China doesn't have money to drill or something, right? Which might not be as strong, but the 2R still has to spend time answering that distinct and diverse solvency deficit, right? So that by itself puts pressure on the 2R. And then our lab hasn't talked about this, but I think the other lab probably has. You want to, maybe in the 1AR, if there's a disad that the negative block extended, but you don't think they're going to go for it, then you might consider straight turning that advantage or that disadvantage and forces the negative to find a way to get out of it or forces the negative to answer it. And then the final tip I have for giving a good 1AR is that you want to read evidence on crucial questions that will influence the debate, including including on the question that the 2A wants to go for in the 2AR, right? A good way to develop an argument in the 1AR is to read more evidence on it and indict the negative evidence. But you probably don't want to read more evidence on questions that the 2AR doesn't plan on going for. Does that make sense? Okay. Finally, 2AR tips. Ideally, you will consult with the 1A, but the thing about being the 2A and giving the 2AR is that you're the captain of the affirmative shift, and you get to pick what argument you go for. So, with a little advice from your 1A, but ultimate decisions up to the 2A, you get to pick. The important part about, giving a good 2AR is there's no negative speech after this, right? So you don't have to be deceptive. You don't have to spend time on arguments that aren't going to win you the debate, right? There's no negative speech to put pressure on. So this is the time where you don't spend time on arguments that are not going to win you the debate. You should only spend time on arguments that are going to win you the debate, right? So the reason why theory arguments have increased value in the 1AR is because the negative doesn't know whether or not you're going to go for them. But theory arguments have decreased value unless it's all of the 2AR, because there's no deception that you have to do, right? You're either going to win theory and the debate's over, so you only have to spend time on that, or you're not going to win theory and it's a total waste of time to spend that in the 2AR, right? So in contrast with the 1AR's, pick and choose but be diverse, for the 2AR, you have to pick and choose your best arguments but be decisive. When you're giving a 2AR, you don't want to waver between a bunch of different arguments that you're not going to win the debate on. You just pick the arguments that you're going to win the debate on, right? For example, so let's say you spend 20 seconds on 3 arguments in the 2AR, but 1 minute on 1 argument. What do you think gives you the best chance of winning? 1 minute on, but in the 1AR, what probably puts more pressure on the 2AR? The first one, exactly, right? So you can see how the 1AR differs a lot from the 2AR when thinking about affirmative strategy. And contrasting again with the 1AR, you don't want to ever read new evidence in the 2AR, because if you're reading evidence to develop or construct an argument in the 2AR, then you've done something pretty wrong, right? You haven't been doing a good job developing your arguments if you have to read evidence in the 2AR. And then the final tip for the 2AR is that you have to tell a story. You have to write, in sort of what Michaela had in her lectures, you have to write the ballot for the judge. And this is your time to talk pretty and tell a story and sort of talk about all the arguments that the negative has. And if you pick and choose and are decisive and don't waste time on useless arguments, then you can give a really good 2AR. And then the last sort of thing that I'll say for the 2AR is that you want to make even-if statements. That means in the 2AR you have to be cognizant of, can you win all of the arguments? Most likely not. You're not going to win 100% of every single argument. I know a few people in our lab think that they can win every single argument, or like to think that they can win every single argument, but that's just not going to happen. And so you need to be realistic with the judge and says, well, maybe we're only going to win 70% of this argument. But even if we lose 30%, we're still going to win the debate. But that makes sense to everyone? All right. What?